Okay, so on to Adam, Eve, and the dragon. Did you know there was dragons in the Bible? There's a few of them. So we're going to look at Genesis 2 and 3 today. This is the story set in the Garden of Eden, the creation of man and woman, and of course the serpent and the fall. So we're going to look at all of that now. This will be a reasonably long session, I think. What we're going to do is we're going to have a very quick recap of the church's teaching, read Genesis 2 and 3 right the way through, and I'll offer observations as I go. It's not really all that long in the scheme of things, so I think it's worth going through it from start to finish. We're also going to look at where Eden is. That's an interesting one. You'll find out as well what was Adam's job. Adam had a job, believe it or not. Was it all Eve's fault? Eve gets a bad press over the centuries, but was it all her fault? We'll look at that too. And we'll look at the question of punishment. Is God punishing them? So we had this slide in the previous session on Genesis, but it's worth repeating. This is quoting the Council of Trent and Vatican II. So this is church teaching we have to take seriously. The account of the fall in Genesis 3 uses figurative language, but affirms a primeval event, a deed that took place at the beginning of the history of man. Revelation gives us the certainty of faith that the whole of human history is marked by the original fault freely committed by our first parents. And that's quoted from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 390. So all of what we're going to read we understand as being true. True as something that really happened. There was a real separation between the first humans and God, an original sin, an original fault. But the story's told in figurative language or theological language. So if the idea of a talking snake makes you think Disney and you think, well, I shouldn't take it seriously for that reason, I refer you to the previous video where I talk about theological language. But with that quick reminder out of the way, on to Genesis 2. In the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, when no plant of the field was yet in the earth, and no herb of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was no one to till the ground. But a stream would rise up from the earth and water the whole face of the ground. We'll pause there for a moment. I think this thing, there was no one to till the ground, that's a significant thing, because we're going to find out somebody's job is to till the ground. But right from the start of this story, we see there's an importance to work and the earth being worked. And we've seen God working for 6 days in Genesis 1 and then resting. And mankind is going to imitate God in the sense that he's going to work. Adam is going to have a job. Oops, spoiler alert. So let's carry on. Then the Lord God formed man, Adam, from the earth, Adama, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. So there's a bit of wordplay going on in the Hebrew here, Adam and Adama, earth and earthling, and if you like. But man is something created out of the earth, brought forth out of the earth, really formed from the earth. But not earth on his own, because God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. So the earth wasn't, just the earth didn't make man. And in Hebrew and Greek, ruah and pneuma both mean breath or spirit. So we could say that God put his spirit into, or the spirit of life into man. And that man became a living being. So there's a sense in which, there's a spark of divinity in man, and earth and God's breath or God's spirit, there's a sense already of body and soul here. It's not spelled out in that way because, as I said in the past, this is explaining things in a story, not in terms of Greek logic or theology or philosophy. But there's a sense of body and soul here already, I think. And the Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east. Pretty vague at the moment where Eden is, but we'll come back to that. And there he put the man whom he had formed. Out of the ground the Lord God made to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So everything is all the trees here are good to look at, good to eat, and you've got these two special ones: the tree of life, which we only hear about again at the end, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which we'll see more about in a moment. But lots of food, nice things to look at. This is a place where where a man should be happy. But then we go on. A river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and there it divided and became 4 rivers. The name of the first is Pishon. It is the one which flows around the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. And the gold of that land is good. Bdellium and onyx stone are there. So this is quite detailed, but to my knowledge, nobody knows where Pishon is. Perhaps better scholars than me know, but I don't. I think it's unknown. But again, it's something which what comes out of Eden creates a rich land. Bdellium is a kind of myrrh, incense, I believe, and a golden onyx stone. So what comes out of Eden creates good land. That's another thing which suggests it's a sort of Eden is kind of paradise. The name of the second river is Gihon. It is the one which flows around the whole land of Cush. So we don't know where the first river is, but the second one, Cush, we know is Ethiopia. And there's a lake in Ethiopia which is associated, and a river which I believe are associated with this river Gihon. But notice where Ethiopia is on the map. Where the third and the fourth rivers are, which we'll come to in a second, they're in the orange area. So where are these supposed to be flowing out of? Where's Eden meant to be if the rivers are all flowing out of them? You begin to see there's a geographical problem here. And if you're not sure where Israel or Judah is, it's just off to the left of the orange area on the Mediterranean coast. So it's difficult to see really how the geography works. And the name of the third river is Tigris, which flows east of Assyria. And the fourth river is the Euphrates. Okay, now these rivers, we all know where they are. You can see on the map here, around the Baghdad area, in modern Iraq. And of course, the Jews knew where they were. This is the region called Mesopotamia. I've mentioned it several times. Assyria, which I've circled red, Assur on this map, is a place that was known to the Jews because the northern kingdom of Israel was taken into exile by them. Babylon is just off the south of the map. Again, another place where the Jews were taken into exile. This whole Mesopotamian region is one that the Jews were familiar with in a way that British people are familiar with Europe. It's not their homeland, but it's a place where they had plenty of contact with. This isn't mysterious at all. But the geography for the rivers doesn't match up. So why are we getting from the writer of Genesis, why are we getting this sort of confusing geography of the rivers? Why are we told that? I think what's happening is that it's saying these are all real rivers. They all come out of Eden. God creates everything. But this isn't a place you're meant to find your way to. We're not talking about a road map. And if you know about the angel with a fiery sword at the end of the story, you probably wouldn't want to find your way to Eden. It wouldn't be a very good idea. I think it also suggests the figurative language, that this is something real that happened, like these are real rivers. Even the one that's unknown is presumably real, just unknown to us or me. But it's not meant to be in a real, it's not meant to be set in a historical situation. By comparison, so yes, figurative and theological language, really. By comparison, I'll just give you very quickly the book of Judith, 1:1. If you have a Protestant Bible, this would be in a Deuterocanonical book, or it might not be in there at all if it's a Protestant Bible. Some of them don't, many of them don't have them, but Catholic Bibles do have it. And this starts off, it was the 12th year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, who ruled over the Assyrians in the city of Nineveh. In those days, Arphaxad ruled over the Medes and Ecbatana. So to start at the end, we know all about the Medes and Ecbatana. Those are real people and places. We don't know about a ruler called Arphaxad, or at least I don't. That doesn't mean he didn't exist. We just don't know about him. Maybe he didn't exist. Particularly when you look at the first sentence, because Nebuchadnezzar was a king of the Babylonians. He was the one who took the Jews off into exile. He didn't rule over the Assyrians. The Assyrians had already taken the northern kingdom of Israel into exile long before Nebuchadnezzar came along. So I think this sets up the book of Judith. It's a bit like as being something which isn't meant to be historical. Again, figurative theological language. It would be like saying to a British person, when Hitler ruled in Napoleonic France, and you would think to yourself, well, that was probably a bad day for Britain. You picture that story, and that's not good news for Britain. Just as Nebuchadnezzar ruling over the Assyrians would be bad news for the Jews. But it's not a historical thing, it's figurative, theological language. So I'd offer you that by way of comparison, because I think it's important to try and avoid reading this too literalistically, shall we say. Anyway, back to Genesis. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and keep it. So man gets his job, and his job is to look after the garden. And the Lord God commanded the man, you may eat freely of every tree in the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall die. So God's given man a job, he's dignifying him with work, but he's also rewarding him fairly. He's going to be able to get food. This isn't slavery. Man's got great liberty within the garden. And this warning about the knowledge about dying if he eats from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, I take that as not I'm going to strike you down, but this is what happens when you eat poisonous fruit. Because we would, in our own lives, we would warn people not to eat poisonous fruit because it will kill you. So we have, I don't read this as God threatening man, but more explaining the sort of the spiritual physics or the spiritual biology, if you prefer. If you do this, then this is going to happen. If you eat of the fruit I've told you not to, you'll die, just as if I was to eat poisonous mushrooms, I might die. But it's interesting to ponder what kind of death, because obviously Adam and Eve do eat of this fruit and they don't physically die. If they did, the story would come to an end rather abruptly, but it doesn't. So the death which God is thinking of is presumably not a physical death. In some ways, it's going to be a death in their relationship. It's not quite as straightforward a meaning of death, I think, as you might believe. Okay, then the Lord God said, "It's not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper as his partner." Helper here, the Hebrew word azer, is a divine helper. God isn't making someone to tidy up after the man, wash his socks, do his laundry. No, this is a much more dignified role for a woman. She's a divine helper. We all knew that anyway, didn't we? But I think the next bit has a certain comic element to it, if you reread on. So out of the ground the Lord God formed every animal of the field and every bird of the air, and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called each living creature, that was its name. The man gave names to all cattle and to the birds of the air and to every animal of the field. But for the man there was not found a helper as his partner. So first of all, God's delegating some of his authority here. The man gives names to things and to animals, and that's what they're called. Man has a certain amount of authority which God has given him. Because in the Bible, it's usually God who names people. Abram becomes Abraham. If you look at the New Testament, Simon becomes Peter. There's a sense in which Jesus is doing something divine in renaming Simon as Peter. So this is so man is meant to have authority over animals, but none of these animals which are beneath him, which he has authority over, which he names, none of them is really suitable as a divine helper, as a companion. And I imagine this almost slightly comic, because all of this would have been read orally. I imagine it perhaps being embellished with God presenting the man with a giraffe. Look, this great animal, long neck, don't you love it? Or the elephant, look at that trunk, look at those ears, isn't that what you wanted? No, sure. What about a puppy? About a dog as man's best friend. But the man's still sort of not going for the puppy as or the dog as his best friend, but knowing that that's not something which is quite right. So there's a uniqueness to the relationship between men and women, and no relationship with another animal can really meet that. Like I say, I see a bit of divine humour in this. So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and he slept. Then he took one of his ribs and closed up its place with flesh. And the rib that the Lord God had taken from man, he made into a woman, and brought her to the man. So, not too much to say here, but God's very gentle here. He sort of almost gives man an anesthetic. He puts him in a deep sleep. He's not going to feel any pain while God carries out this operation. When God makes woman is a painless experience for the man. There's no violence in Genesis, contrary to the sort of Babylonian and Greek myths that you come across. Anyway, when man sees woman, this is what he says. This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of man she was taken. Therefore a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. So a couple of things to say here. Man recognizes in woman something unique, something with which he can have a special relationship. And he goes out of his way not to name her. He says, shall be called. He doesn't name her. That comes at the end of the story, once it's all gone wrong. So there's no naming. There's no man's authority over woman at this stage. There's an equalness between the two. And you see that again when it says they become one flesh, when they cling to each other. On some levels, that's a a reference to sex and the unitive aspect of a man and a woman being married and having those relations. And that there's no, in Eden, before things go wrong, there's no shame about that, as there is later on. That it's meant to be something pure, and it is something pure. It's interesting as well, verse 24, a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife. Socially, in the ancient world, including the Jewish world, women left their fathers and mothers to join the husband's household, not the other way around. So this sort of ideal state in Eden is the opposite to what Jews were experiencing, or Israelites, or anyone else in the ancient world. That was so there's something before the society which they lived in, which was meant to be more equal. So it's all been going so well, and there's a man and a woman happy together. But of course, then we have the serpent come along. And I say the serpent, but it's only at the end when God tells him he's going to crawl on his belly in the dust. So you kind of assume he had legs at the start. And a snake or a serpent with legs is generally a dragon. You can kind of make of that what you will. We'll see that it's different people make different things of it, but it's worth pointing out. Now the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God say, 'You shall not eat from any tree in the garden'?" So first thing to say, God made the serpent. He's an animal who God made. So he's meant to be below men and women. And the serpent's crafty. And his technique is to cast doubt on God. And that's always a proposition of evil, of the devil, is to cast doubt on God. Did God say? Well, yes, he did, and they know that, but it's casting doubt. The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, 'You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die.'" So notice somebody here has added something to what God said, because God didn't say if you'll die if you touch it. He said you'll die if you eat it. And it's who's getting this wrong? Did Eve get this wrong, or did Adam get it wrong when he told Eve? We don't know. But certainly they've got God's message wrong. And there's another thing we can see in all our lives is adding to God's message or getting it wrong is a dangerous thing. But the serpent said to the woman, "You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So again, the serpent is, I think, in some way misrepresenting what's going on here. We see that they eat from it and they don't immediately die. So what's the explanation? Probably the simplest one is that they do eventually die after they leave Eden. But certainly, I think, as well, a sense of death of innocence, a sort of moral death, which comes from disobeying God as well. But physical death is clearly an eventual outcome. They just don't die straight away, so they assume that perhaps they take that as showing that God was wrong. Other important thing to mention is this suggestion from the serpent: "You will be like God, knowing good and evil." I think we all want to, there's human tendency to want to be like God, or to be more powerful, and the temptation of evil is always to become more like God in the wrong way. And he's selling, what the serpent here is selling is a lie. They don't become more like God, they become less like God. Knowing good and evil is not nearly as much fun as they think it's going to be. It sounds like a good idea, but it isn't. Plenty of examples of that in all our lives, I'm sure. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. So the woman comes up with two excuses, or two reasons, I suppose, beyond what the serpent suggests, which is making her wise. But she sees it's good for food and a delight to the eyes. But this is, we heard before, this is true of all the fruit in the garden. God made it all good for food and delightful to look at. But she takes those things and she sees another reason to eat it. So once we're tempted, we often rationalize and find other reasons, excuses to do things that we shouldn't, all on our own. And she also gave some of the fruit to her husband, who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. So here's a bit of a revelation. Her husband, Adam, was with her the entire time. Well, what's he been doing? Because remember, his job is to look after the garden. He's supposed to be tilling it and keeping it. So he presumably meant to know about the plants and the animals. And he doesn't get involved at all. He doesn't do his job. Doesn't correct the serpent. Doesn't stop Eve from eating the tree which he's not eating from the tree which he's not meant to. And when she gives it to her, he joins in. So Adam's sin is really is falling asleep on the job. It's what he fails to do. And what we fail to do is often, it can be as bad a sin as what we do intentionally. So I think personally, I think it's a bit unfair that Eve has had quite so much stick over the centuries for all of this. I think there's plenty of blame to go around in this story. I wouldn't see Adam as being without fault at all. On the contrary. So then we see the results of this sin. Their eyes are open. They're naked. They knew they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. So sudden realization is something unpleasant. Knowledge of good and evil isn't what they hoped for. As we'll see in a moment, they start to feel ashamed, and they try to fix it. But if you've ever seen a painting of Adam and Eve with fig leaf loincloths, you'll see they don't fix it very well, because a fig leaf doesn't make much of a loincloth. So then God returns. They heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze. And the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. So here's another very characteristic human response to sin, is to hide ourselves from God, which we see quite often, and we see often when we don't want to go to confession. But the Lord God called to the man and said to him, "Where are you?" He said, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself." So God comes looking for man, even despite what man's done. And man is afraid, and because he was naked, he's afraid of what was completely natural to him before. It's perhaps this is the death of innocence rather than physical death. That when before everything goes wrong, they're naked and they're not ashamed and everything's fine. But now they are. This knowledge isn't what they were hoping for or expecting. He said, "Who told you that you were naked?" So God said, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you not to eat?" So God gives the man a chance to explain. The man said, "The woman whom you gave me to be with me, she gave me the fruit from the tree and I ate." So this isn't very edifying, really. The man's immediate reaction is to blame God. You gave me the woman, and then he blames his wife. She gave me the fruit from the tree I just ate. Adam doesn't really come over very well in my view. He's a bit pathetic. And blaming God and blaming other people are, again, things that I'm sure we can probably all relate to. I can anyway. Then the Lord God said to the woman, "What is this that you have done?" So God treats the man and the woman equally. He asks her for her explanation. The woman said, "The serpent tricked me and I ate." This is fractionally better. But I mean, the serpent doesn't have to try very hard to trick Eve. It's not as if he has to make multiple attempts to lead her astray. She's pretty easily led. So her excuse, I think, is fractionally better than Adam's, but basically she blames the serpent. Now, notice that God doesn't ask the serpent for an explanation. He doesn't have the dignity of a human person. God said to the serpent, the Lord God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, cursed are you among all animals, and among all wild creatures. Upon your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life." So no legs anymore, so dragon to serpent, presumably. And God curses him, or he is cursed because of what he's done. There's, I think, a spiritual physics at work here, because he's been the cause of this breakdown between humans and God. He's going to suffer as a result as well. "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel." If you look in the book of Revelation at the dragon and the woman and her offspring, you might see people have often seen seen reference to this, whereas this is a sort of connection. And the woman has been seen as a type of Mary, and her offspring obviously as a type of Jesus, because Jesus is the one who destroys death and the devil, and Mary enables that by agreeing to carry him, to give birth to him. And the Church Fathers talked a lot about this, and it could be a video in its own right, so we won't dwell on it here, but it is worth mentioning. To the woman, he said, God said, "I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." So she isn't cursed like the serpent, but there's going to be more suffering as a result of this. Interestingly, I think her desire will be for her husband, but he will rule over her. The relationship between men and women is broken down. It's not going to be the way God meant it to be, this sort of radical equality. That the man is going to rule over the woman, but she's still going to yearn for him. And to the man he said, "Because you've listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree about which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, until you return to the ground. For out of it you are taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. So, again, I would read this as a sort of spiritual physics, cause and effect, rather than God smiting the man. The ground is cursed because of you. What the man has done has caused this, not what God has done. It's the result of, the toil which man is going to have is going to be a result of his own actions. Humanity's actions, our first ancestors, as the Catechism puts it. And the reason for that is because he didn't do what God told him, which in many ways is what a lot of the Bible is saying. If you do what the Lord God tells you, you'll be okay. It's a very common theme in the Bible. So now the man named his wife Eve because she was the mother of all living. So Eve is a bit like the word for living in Hebrew, so there's a bit more wordplay here. But interestingly, where we saw, when man first saw woman, he didn't name her. He said, she shall be called. Now he's naming her. He's asserting dominion over her. So patriarchy, if you like, starts here. And it wasn't what God had intended. It's a result of the first human sin, this division between man and woman, which exists in the world. And the Lord God made garments of skins for the man and his wife, and clothed them. So even now, God has compassion on them. They've got these loin cloths made of fig leaves. They're not going to get them very far. God clothes them. He gives them something better. And that's worth noting for what comes next. Then the Lord God said, see, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Now he might reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. So people sometimes think this is God saying, humans might rise to the state of God and might challenge me, threaten me. But I don't think that really makes a lot of sense, because we've just seen in the previous verse that humans can't even clothe themselves properly. They rely on God for that. So the idea that that humans might sort of threaten God doesn't seem to me very likely. What I think is more likely, and what some people have suggested, is that if humans then ate from the tree of life, the whole thing might become irreversible. Because as it is, there's after death, there's a hope for reconciliation with God. Certainly in a Christian framework, we have this hope that God can, that through the death of Jesus and his resurrection, we can be saved. But I think this is more, the end of the story is God taking precautions so that man and woman can't make this state of affairs irreversible. Therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. He drove out the man at the east of the Garden of Eden he placed a cherubim and a sword flaming and turning to guard the way to the tree of life. So notice man's still going to be working. His original job still stands. That hasn't been taken away from him. And he's still got work for his dignity. But God's not now. I think now that God's seen man can't be trusted, we hear this we have this angel protecting the tree of life so that it can't go further wrong. People often ask, why did God put the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the garden where man could come to harm? Why would you put something there which could be harmful to Adam and Eve? And that's a really interesting question. It's not a terribly simple one to answer. A lot of it has to do with, why does God allow evil in the world? Myself, I tend to think God gave man and woman free will, and that he trusted them to use it right. That's not a final answer to the question of evil by any means, or problem of evil. But I think within the context of the Garden of Eden stories, God simply trusted them to not to harm themselves. That would be my take on it anyway. So to sum up, it's been a rather long talk, I think, but hopefully interesting. This is very much a theological and figurative text. Don't try reading it as history, or at least I wouldn't advise you reading it as history. Read it as something which tells you about the relationship between God and humanity, and about the relationship between men and women. And work as well, I think, has quite a prominent role here. So yes, man is created to work, humans are created to work, not, but perhaps especially males, would be the implication of the story. Follow God's instructions, not those of the serpent or the dragon, or even other humans. Do what God says, don't do what creatures say. Personally, I think Adam and Eve are equally at fault in this story. Despite the sort of historically bad press that Eve's got, I don't see Adam as coming out very well. And looking at the sort of so-called punishment sections, I think this is more sort of spiritual physics, rather than God deciding to sort of give them a whipping. Because they've done this, this is what happens, just as if you were to eat poisonous mushrooms, you'd get ill or die. So that's it for this talk. I hope it's been interesting. And thank you very much for your time and listening.